and thank you, Alistair. As he mentioned, I'm a newly minted assessment biologist with the Lake Ontario Management Unit. I'm lucky enough to join this project on the second year, but I want to acknowledge up front Dr. Bruce Tufts and Jim Hoyle, who are essentially the brains behind this project, and like I said, I'm lucky to join on at this point. And with a cooperative mindset, I just want to acknowledge their work leading up to this and moving forward, looking how we can use this information to inform our assessment program as well as certain management priorities. And as well, it sounds like Bruce is going to have a PhD student come on to push this project further from a research perspective. I also want to acknowledge all the students at Queen's University that were involved with this program up to this point, and in particular our LOMU staff that have been involved with the tagging as well as receiver retrieval and maintenance. Okay, and so with that we'll just get started. So this talk today is looking at using acoustic telemetry to look at the spatial ecology of Bay of Quinte and Eastern Lake Ontario walleye. And I'd like to start with this photo at the top here. This is taken walleye opening at the Trent to the mouth of the Trent River. So this is when walleye are expected to come out. It just goes to show that we can use some new technologies here, but anglers are already in tune with the movements of walleye in the lake, and this is essentially what started this project for us. So as Jim mentioned earlier in the day, the population we're looking at here is the walleye population in the Bay of Quinte and Eastern Basin. It's a very important population for Lake Ontario. So just a map here to kind of orient ourselves as we move forward through this presentation. The Bay of Quinte on the left. I've highlighted some different areas here which I'm going to be referring to, so the Napanee and Trent Rivers, so some spawning locations that we know of. As well, though, walleye do spawn along the shoreline in the Bay of Quinte. Once done spawning, the idea is the mature walleye leave the bay. So what do we know already about these walleye? So through historical market capture studies, we know that there's some movement between the Bay of Quinte and Eastern Basin. We also have some age-specific geographical and seasonal distribution information, and earlier in the session, Jim pointed to some of that work that's being done in our assessment. So this is through our index gill netting project, as well as some angler effort and catch distribution information. So if you look at that a bit more closely, within the recreational fishery, from May to August, we have a fishery in the upper and middle bay for small fish or small walleye. October to December, we see the middle and lower bay, a large fishery kind of forming. And then December, January into March, we see a winter fishery in the upper and middle bay with fish of all sizes. Highlighted in blue here is this kind of newer fishery that's developed for trophy fishing in Eastern Basin, Lake Ontario, through August to October. And so questions around that essentially kind of kick-started this project and kind of leading us where we are today. So what does this information tell us that we already know? So we know that the Bay of Quinte walleye are highly migratory. We know that these seasonal movements and patterns are related to different life cycle requirements, so spawning and foraging. And then to that effect, we also know that some of the drivers may include things like water temperature or prey. But as to this time, it hasn't been studied beyond what we do now. So what we don't know are these specific seasonal timings and cues associated with those movements. We're looking at for fine scale, geographical, and seasonal resolution in these movements, as well as potentially looking at spawning and site fidelity or frequency of spawning. So for this presentation, I've essentially framed two primary drivers or questions, but not to say that this is where we're limiting our research at this time. So the first question here is, what is the summer and fall distribution and movement patterns of mature walleye in Eastern Lake Ontario? So just essentially, is this distribution random, or are there key areas where walleye aggregate? The second question here we're looking at in the early years of this study do all the walleye in the Eastern Lake Ontario originate from the Bay of Quinte? So are they a Bay of Quinte stock? So to do that, we're looking at the question, do larger walleye tagged in the lake during the summer migrate back to the bay to spawn the following spring? And that's kind of addressing that trophy walleye fishery that was developing in the summer. So to do this, I'm just going to kind of quickly go through our methods for last year. So last year we used trap netting and boat electrofishing to catch fish in the spring during the spawn. So this was done in the rivers as well as the shoreline spawners. And then in the summer to catch those trophy or larger walleye in the eastern basin, we used angling. So they contracted out some charter fishermen. We implanted V16 Vemco tags, some temp loggers, which we can talk more about if anyone has questions later. And we also used external tags for ID purposes. So again here, the GLaDOS map here just kind of shows the receiver array at the time we were pulling from. These have kind of been described now through Brent and through some other presentations, so I won't go into that detail. But essentially we utilize the GLaDOS system, which is a key component for us, being able to share that data and pick up our fish on all those receiver arrays. Okay, so the tagging, as I said, we had some in the spring. So we had 10 fish tagged in April in Big Bay, and then 10 down by Glenora. We had another 6 tagged during the spawning in May in the Trent River. We let those fish go, and then in August we tagged another 10 out around Timber Island with those chartered fishermen. So for the purposes today, I'm just going to focus on some early results for that first question. So what is the summer and fall distribution and movement patterns of mature walleye in eastern Lake Ontario? So I have a series of maps here I'm just going to kind of flip through, so just stay with me. Essentially we have our Bay of Quinte on the left, Eastern Basin on the right. All the dots represent receivers that were in the lake at the time. Smaller dots that aren't colored are receivers that were out and picking up signals, but no fish were detected. The larger circles are receivers that detected fish, with the saturation of the red being the number of fish detected, or unique fish detected. On the bottom I also have NT, which is the total number of tagged fish in this population I'm talking about, and NO are those fish that we didn't see during this time period. And we're just doing by month for simplicity's sake for this presentation. So in April you can see we have 20 fish in the tagged population. They're all hanging out in the bay, which we expect near the release sites. By May, this is when you remember we added now 6 more fish at the Trent River, and we can see very quickly the saturation around Amherst Island, in the middle there, between Bay of Prince Edward County and Amherst Island, so we see some deep reds there. But already we see fish moving quite quickly into New York waters, picking up some of our colleagues' receivers. Come June, we see some higher saturation in New York waters. We see some saturation of fish around Melville Shoal, and as well as some in Timber Island. You can see the bloat array has since disappeared. We haven't retrieved that data yet, but we're eager to get our hands on that to kind of see where our fish showed up there. As we move into July, Timber Island and Melville Shoal seem to light up even more. And in August, Timber Island clearly becomes a hotspot for these fish. And then to note though, we do see some fish, number of fish 7 here missing. Those aren't all the same fish, so some fish kind of go off our radar around Timber Island and then come back the next month. And then by September, we start seeing some fish coming back into Eastern Basin proper, or Kingston Basin. And October, we start to see some movement back into the Bay of Quinte. So up until this point, this is all the receiver data we have for now, but it's provided some really early insights into the distribution pattern. So some highlights. In general, most of the walleye that left the bay left within a month of being tagged, and if they move to New York waters, they move very, very quickly, so within weeks. Of those individuals that were tagged and picked up in the Bay of Quinte, 80% of those left the Bay of Quinte. Of those, 35%, so about a third, ended up in New York waters within the spring. So that was really interesting for us, which was something we didn't know, and to quantify that. So we also highlighted some areas of aggregation. So we saw this gap between Prince Edward County and Amherst Island light up. The south shore of Amherst Island towards Melville Shoal and the west end of Wolf Island seemed to be a pathway for walleye. We saw fish show up in New York waters as well as Timber Island. As I alluded to, we identified some blind spots, so fish potentially leaving our receiver array from Timber Island, but when we get some information from the bloater array, this might help kind of fill in some gaps. And then to this point too, we've also started to build some operational capacity and build some teams dedicated to this project moving forward. So I've thrown some next steps on here, but essentially we're going out in a couple weeks to tag 30 more fish during spawning time, and we're working with our partners at Queen's to tag some additional fish in June on Melville Shoals. So those fish that are out of the Bay of Quinte. And then we're continuing to working from an operational capacity to maintain this receiver array moving forward. So it's a very brief overview, but with that I'll take any questions, or I'm happy to follow up after this if anyone has further questions or comments.